11.
Right now on Chronicle in high definition.
The crime of the century terrorized the city.
In the greater area of Boston, no woman alone was safe.
Phil DiNatale, the Boston cop consumed by the case. Albert DeSalvo, the man who confessed to 13 murders.
Everything I am, I hate, and almost can't believe it was me.
F. Lee Bailey, the lawyer who made a name for himself.
Everybody wanted the credit for catching the strangler.
Tangled lives in the case of the Boston Strangler. For the first time, Detective DiNatale, in his own words,
this is the untold story of the Boston Strangler.
Revealing details never broadcast till now. The Boston Strangler, next on Chronicle.
Good evening. It's said to be the first serial murder case in the country. The gruesome slayings of 13 women in the Boston area believed to have been the work of one man who came to be known simply as the Boston Strangler.
50 years after the murder of the very first victim, it's a case that officially remains open, and some have doubts we'll ever know the answers. Anthony Everett reports.
We were desperate for clues, and we listened. I listened to the garbage man if he had something to tell me.
This is the voice of Phil DiNatale, one of the lead investigators of the notorious rash of killings that would haunt the city of Boston for years. Phil died in 1987.
This one here in June 67.
But today, his son, John DiNatale, and his grandson, Miles Jewell, are in the finishing stages of a documentary film called Stranglehold, in the shadow of the Boston Strangler.
This is the untold story of the Boston Strangler.
It's the story of a veteran cop, his meticulous style of investigation, and his near obsession with a case that took far too long to solve. To this day, some people contend it never has been solved. That does not include Miles, who holds a master's in film from NYU. This is his first major project.
When I first started making the movie, it was for sure a kind of whodunit. Like, this is going to be the final chapter. We're going to tell my grandfather's story, how consumed he got with his professional life and how that affected our family.
It began on June 14th of 1962, Ann Slessor's murder. This murder was the turning point, the greatest turning point, and the greatest thrill of my life.
I remember not seeing much of my dad. I remember being from the ages of really from 10 until my teen years. He was kind of like a phantom in the house.
One comment on me was that nobody heard any rustling, banging, screaming in all 13 murders.
In the same month, the elderly Mary Mullen, Nina Nichols, and Helen Blake were all found dead in their apartments, while Ida Erga and Jane Sullivan were found in August. A second round of strangulations left 2 girls dead in the cold month of December, 20-year-old Sophie Clark and 23-year-old Patricia Bassett. Unlike the other victims, the murder of these 20-somethings made it clear that in the greater area of Boston, no woman alone was safe. After a few months of no new stranglings in early 1963, another 5 women were found: Mary Brown, Beverly Sammons, Evelyn Corbin, Joan Graff, and finally, New Year's Day of January 1964, the youngest murder victim was found in her apartment on Charles Street, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan, totaling 13 bodies in 18 months.
With murders in several jurisdictions, then Attorney General Ed Brooke appointed a task force to investigate the killer now known as the Boston Strangler. Phil DiNatale, a Boston detective, was asked to join the squad, and he brought plenty to the table, including the commitment to work endless hours for no overtime pay, plus an uncanny ability to keep complex records well before the age of computers.
When you look through my dad's files, you see mugshots of so many different individuals, so many separate manila files of individual names that they would be checking out, you know, where they worked, where they were in work, I mean, you know, pounding on doors.
It was Phil's instinct that helped him crack the case. He was convinced that one of the victims held a special link to the killer. Sophie Clark, the Strangler's only black victim, was a medical student.
Sophie Clark was a murder that was real warm. What I mean by warm, the police were there within hours.
Phil tracked down nearly every person she ever knew and was still looking to interview 2 nurses with whom she had worked. That's when the most important tip of the entire case came to him from a security guard at Massachusetts General Hospital.
Always keeping records of his day-to-day, Phil's journals document how the case of the Boston Strangler finally broke. Beginning with an anonymous letter that the head of security of Mass General forwarded to Phil, his journals begin. He told me about a good suspect and gave me some information on one Albert H. DeSalvo of Malden. An unknown nurse gave him the information.
This young girl was attacked by Albert DeSalvo. And she said that Albert DeSalvo came to her apartment and told her that she was the Boston Strangler after he raped her and bound and gagged her and spread-eagled her.
Albert DeSalvo shot to the top of Phil's list of prime suspects.
As my dad would say, I started to like this guy. I got the little feeling, Johnny, I started to like this guy. So he started checking him out. I looked through my dad's journals. I mean, there are just repeated entries of at the Mass General trying to locate the nurse, at the Mass General trying to locate the nurse, talk to so-and-so, talk. I mean, they worked so hard to try and identify this woman, and they never could.
With Phil's vast file of potential perps, why wasn't DeSalvo in the mix? As it turns out, DeSalvo was supposedly incarcerated for other crimes while most of the stranglings occurred. But it was Phil DiNatale who figured out DeSalvo was, in fact, free at all the right times.
He was supposed to serve about 2 years or a year and a half. He served a couple months and he was out in April of '62. But something happened along the line on his record at the courthouse. They didn't put it down that he was released. They just put it down that he was serving his time. That would mean, if that was true, then he would be in jail the first 8, 9, 10 murders. So that's how everybody overlooked him. No sooner that happened, everybody was jumping on the bandwagon because he'd becoming #1 suspect.
The film Stranglehold was previewed in June at the Coolidge Corner Theater, and it's now under consideration for inclusion in September's Boston Film Festival.
Next, DiNatale takes on Bailey. Who found DeSalvo first?
Well, I just want this to be on record, and this is the truth, so help me God, that we had him first.
It was considered the biggest break in the case of the Boston Strangler. Detective Phil DiNatale had zeroed in on Albert DeSalvo as the prime suspect in the case.
Anthony Everett says DeSalvo was already behind bars at Bridgewater State Hospital, accused in a series of sexual assaults.
DeSalvo was awaiting trial for a series of sexual assaults in which he conned his way into women's apartments, claiming to be either a maintenance man or a scout looking for models.
He'd say, I'm from Stars and Stripes, and we're spending $40 an hour for models. Are you interested in it? If you are, I'd like to measure you. And then those who allowed him to be measured, usually he ended up either raping or voluntarily having sex with.
Once busted, it was clear DeSalvo would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. For Phil DiNatale, that wasn't enough. He wanted the time and resources to prove DeSalvo wasn't just a rapist, he was a serial killer. He wanted a conviction for all the murders. But a hotshot lawyer named F. Lee Bailey would deprive DiNatale and the public of a clear victory. Bailey had gotten a tip from a client named George Nasser, who was also doing time at Bridgewater, that a guy named DeSalvo might be the Strangler.
Mr. Bailey went down to Bridgewater and talked to George Nasser, and at the same time he asked the guy to bring Albert DeSalvo up. Now he wasn't representing DeSalvo. He didn't sign in to see DeSalvo, but he talked to DeSalvo.
Within days, DeSalvo had confessed to Bailey he was the Strangler, making Bailey look like the hero. Phil DiNatale and his associates on the task force were not pleased.
We were working on Albert H. DiSalvo 3 months prior to Billy ever knew about him. And Billy going around saying he found it, that's what upsets me, and that's what gives me a cancer. And I've had it ever since, that when he gets on TV and he blows the balloon up and saying that he is the man that found the Boston Strangler. Well, I just want this to be on record, and this is the truth, so help me God, that we had him first.
Everybody wanted the credit for catching the Strangler.
Today, F. Lee Bailey, the superstar attorney who jetted around the world for decades, lives a quiet life in Maine. At the age of 79, he remembers every detail of the Strangler case, including a controversial interrogation in which he quizzed DiSalvo about the facts.
I had talked to the Boston police. I said, give me a couple of things that would be relevant here that the press never got, but you guys have, and they did. And what they wanted to know was, is just another nut who read the papers and is making up a story, or does he know things only the killer should know? And their first impression was, he's got some awful good answers.
Even though DiSalvo did confess, investigators continued to work feverishly trying to prove the case with facts. Unfortunately, their boss, Attorney General Ed Brooke, was politically not inclined to pursue a murder conviction.
That we only have information which does not amount to evidence, and information is not a basis for the return of an indictment or even presentation before a grand jury. It is far premature to talk about indictments at this stage of the development of this case.
For the Attorney General's office, it was enough to just nail Albert for the B&E and put him away for life without any murder conviction. But this wasn't enough for Phil. Phil and the task force transcribed Albert's confessions and cross-referenced them with anything that was written in the arrest reports, anything that was in the crime scene photographs, anything that was printed in the newspapers, and only things the killer could know. What would these days be thought of as an Excel spreadsheet was then called the diagram of death.
The question that everybody was asking, why did DiSalvo confess?
He knew he would never get out, even though he hadn't been convicted of any murders. He wanted to wind up in a hospital and not a prison or a place like Bridgewater, which does not deserve the word hospital. And he wanted to provide for his family, and he thought if he wrote a book about what he had done, that he could provide for his family.
DiSalvo sold his story to author Gerald Frank and did receive a royalty of about $30,000. But the most dramatic episode of Albert DiSalvo's career came in 1967, just after he'd been sentenced to life in prison.
An escape from this mental institute in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, for the inmate who broke out of his cell and freed 2 cronies is Albert DiSalvo, who says he is the Boston Strangler.
DiSalvo knew he would be caught eventually, which he reveals in a letter written to his prison warden the night of his escape.
I truly thought I was doing the right thing by telling the truth. Each day that goes by, it seems to me to be a waste of time to be living. I'm not going out to hurt anyone. I just wish to die outside these walls. I know they will have orders to shoot me on sight. I can't understand myself, so how can I expect you or anyone else to understand what made me be? Everything I am, I hate, and almost can't believe it was me.
DiSalvo remained at large for just over a day, eventually surrendering after a massive manhunt, and he was then sent to the maximum security prison at Walpole to serve a life sentence for a series of sexual attacks.
Now, his descriptions of the murders had several discrepancies, so many that some wonder, was DiSalvo really the Strangler? That question next.
Albert DiSalvo was confessing to events that never happened.
This is the story of the self-confessed Boston Strangler.
Hollywood thought they got the story right in 1968 when actor Tony Curtis played Albert DiSalvo in the movie The Boston Strangler. Since then, dissecting the life and psyche of Albert DiSalvo has become something of a cottage industry. With no trial and no known physical evidence, all that's left to unofficially indict DiSalvo are hours of confession interviews, including those with his attorney, F. Lee Bailey.
I obtained a copy of the transcript of Bailey's interview of Albert at Bridgewater State Hospital.
For more than a decade, attorney Elaine Whitfield Sharp has been trying to prove DeSalvo's confession was bogus. Her client, DeSalvo's brother, and other family members.
Bailey led him in the questioning. And he would say things like, well, when you went up the stairs, did you see a broad green and white striped chair? Well, this is an example. And Albert would say, yes, yes. And myself and another individual counted the number of leading questions in that interview, and we stopped counting at 350.
The official state interviews were conducted by then Assistant Attorney General John Bottomley, a lawyer who had never handled a criminal case. Nobody was happy with that.
Bottomley, who was an eminent domain lawyer, was going to interrogate the biggest serial killer in the history of the city. Nobody wanted Bottomley to do the interrogation. None of the investigators did. They were so mad. My dad was just like punching his hand through walls.
Bottomley was very inartful. He had no experience, knew nothing about interrogation. But when you boiled it all down, it wasn't the questions, it was the answers. And the ongoing issue, could someone have told this story without having been at the scene?
Others who've studied the 50-plus hours of interviews argue DeSalvo bungled far too many facts.
I put those confession tapes up to the autopsy reports in the murders, and they did not match. Albert DeSalvo was confessing to events that never happened.
Author Casey Sherman is the nephew of Mary Sullivan, the last of the strangling victims. His book, A Rose for Mary, details the facts of her death, concluding an old boyfriend was a much better suspect.
Albert DeSalvo claimed that he had choked Mary with his thumbs pressed against her Adam's apple. Now, her autopsy showed that she was strangled with 2 scarves and a nylon stocking, so Albert DeSalvo could not even get the easiest detail in the last crime correct.
There were these huge discrepancies between the actual facts of each crime and what DeSalvo gave as his version of the facts.
Crime writer Susan Kelly published her book, The Boston Stranglers, plural, in 1996 after talking with detectives from several jurisdictions.
Every person I talked to raised the same question, said to me, who do you think the Boston Strangler was? And at that point, I'd say, I don't know, you tell me. And they'd say, it wasn't Albert DeSalvo. Just everyone in law enforcement.
Kelly also argues the murders were atypical of a serial killer because they didn't follow patterns in age or race or in the crimes themselves.
Some of the crime scenes were much worse than others, much more sadistic, much more violent. So there were not 10 identical features in each case, which is another reason to argue that these were not serial killings.
Even the way that the killers tied the knots in many of the Boston Strangler murders was different from case to case. To me, that's more frightening, because now you know that so many people were capable of these grisly, heinous crimes.
The doubters also point out that DeSalvo supposedly had a photographic memory, meaning he should have remembered every detail.
There is no such thing as a photographic memory. His memory for detail was extraordinary, but it wasn't perfect. And if it had been perfect, I would have been suspicious that somebody was feeding him the answers.
Over the years, F. Lee Bailey has encountered many skeptics. He lost patience long ago.
The naysayers typically are the uninformed, and the less they know, the louder they shout. I've never met one that had a story to tell that was worth listening to. So I don't give them much attention.
My dad said, people can say in 2 sentences that DeSalvo wasn't the strangler. And I can show you documents for 3 weeks that says he was. Casey Sherman's sitting there in a news conference and with the DeSalvo family, and they start talking about my dad and basically calling him incompetent. Wait a second. I'm sorry, but These guys spent too much of their lives working on this. That means all those detectives who worked in those cases never solved them. And I find that hard to believe.
Fascinating. Albert DeSalvo was stabbed to death in his sleep in November of 1973. Some people believe he was killed because he was about to recant his confession.
Others, including F. Lee Bailey, say DeSalvo was killed by rival drug dealers. The case remains open officially, and we'll bring you up to date when Chronicle continues.
The Boston Strangler case is officially still open and presumably still under the jurisdiction of the Attorney General's office. Over a decade ago, the family of Mary Sullivan sponsored DNA testing of semen found on her body, of her exhumed body, that is. Evidence the family says was not that of DeSalvo.
The state also conducted DNA testing, which was, in their own words, severely limited. The AG's office says there's no physical evidence they're aware of in any of the other cases, meaning for now, there is nothing to test using modern DNA science. But the AG's office does say, quote, our office is willing to review options to see if there are any avenues left which might provide answers, end quote. Well, that is Chronicle for tonight. Thank you for joining us. I'm Ted Reinstein.
And I'm Shayna Seymour. Have a great evening, everyone.
Good night.